Thank you all for coming to this semester's presidential lecture. This is a time in higher education when nothing can be assumed. I know that sounds dramatic, but I think we all feel that it's true. We can no longer assume that people value a college education or even want to go to college in the way they did even just 10 years ago. We can no longer assume that people agree that the success of universities and the success of our nation are mutually dependent. We can no longer assume that the difference we make in the world is self-explanatory, or that support for our efforts will be automatic. But the fewer assumptions we make, the more possibilities we open. When nothing is assumed, anything is possible. That's why, right now, universities have a chance to fundamentally renew our relationship with the American people. And when I think about how we can do that, I think about a similar moment of perilous possibility. After the Second World War, nothing seemed guaranteed. The creation of nuclear weapons, the escalating rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, millions of soldiers returning home, it all blurred the shape of the future. And in this high uncertainty, President Harry Truman formed the first presidential commission on higher education in American history. He wanted to know how universities could help clarify the way forward. The commission wrote a report titled Higher Education for American Democracy. They asserted that education was one of the central efforts of any democracy, and that the flourishing of our nation depended on the flourishing of our universities. They saw the work of higher education as a form of public service that included scientific research. On that topic, they wrote, "The ultimate justification for progress in science, social, and natural is the contribution it can make to the welfare of people everywhere." 80 years later, scientific research is still a decisive way that universities can tangibly benefit all of humanity and reconnect the American people with our work. There are few people who have given as much thought to how we can fulfill that possibility than our lecturer this evening. He has 3 graduate degrees to reflect his triple expertise: an MD, an MPP, and a PhD. He has served as president of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, provost of Harvard University, and most recently, president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. In short, he has been a leader in medicine, higher education, and public policy for over 40 years. Now he's turned his focus to the way university research is evaluated and rewarded. He's led workshops on the subject at the National Academies, and he's promoted efforts to innovate on how academia incentivizes partnership and practical service and research. I'm grateful for his partnership in coming to share his insights with us, and I'm looking forward to learning more about how the practical work of universities can serve the hopeful ideals of our nation and humanity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harvey Fineberg.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, President McGinnis, for such a generous and thoughtful introduction. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today about the future and the race for the future, what countries, what values will prevail. Let's start with a question. It's a simple question. What is the country that has the world's largest economy, the strongest military, the world standard currency, and the greatest cultural influence across the globe? Anyone have the answer? Anyone? The United States of America. Any other? Everyone agree? Here's another answer. Great Britain, 1885. All the same qualities. We could have said Spain in the 15th century, Rome in the 1st century. The lesson is that there's nothing guaranteed. Even a country that thinks of itself as the indispensable global partner, as the last best hope of Earth, has no guarantee of lasting supremacy. Here's another question. Over the next 5 years, which would you prefer? Two choices. A, that the US economy grow by 10%, or B, that the US economy grow by 15%. B, anyone prefer A? Really? That explains why there are so few Yale members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, I think. Okay, now here's a variation of the question. Would you prefer that US grow by 10% while China grows by 7.5%? Or would you prefer the US grows by 15% while China grows by 20%? It's a little harder to answer this one, isn't it, than it was to answer the last one. A kind of basso ostinato for this talk, if you're musically inclined, the bass line that signals the recurring theme, is a wonderful quotation from a fellow named James Frick, who was a vice president for development at the University of Notre Dame. And he said, "Don't tell me where your priorities are. Show me where you spend your money, and I'll tell you what they are." Keep that in mind. A lot of us like to think that America's science is preeminent in the world, and you will often hear this. 20 years ago, at the US National Academies, Norman Augustine, who had been the CEO and Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Army, he led a study called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And this study, which appeared in 2007, explained that while the US is the world leader in science and technology, it is in danger of falling behind. And today, if you go to Washington, if you move around the country and you talk to leaders, they'll often tell you this same thing. We're in danger of falling behind. And the message I want to convey today is that by many measures, in many important and critical areas of science, the US is behind. The US is not at the forefront across the board. Let's look at some of the evidence. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is an independent think tank based in Australia. For decades, they have been tracking performance of different countries around 64 domains of science. This slide depicts some of those domains. If you go back 20 years to the time of the Augustine report, in the period 2003 to 2007, the US led in 60 of the 64 technologies. China at that time led in 3. Fast forward 20 years, the most recent release study by the Australian Institute, 2019, 2023, their judgment, China is now leading in 57 of the 64, and the US is leading in the remaining 7. Let's look at patents, which is a highly imperfect indicator of innovation or intellectual advancement, but still an indicator. For 40 years, the United States was by far the leading contributor to world patent applications. In 2021, for the first time, China surpassed the United States in the number of new patents. And by 2023, China was issuing more than 25% more patents than the US. We like to think we're really strong in artificial intelligence, and we are at the forefront. But consider this. In the 8 years between 2014 and 2023, Chinese inventors filed 6 times more patents than the US related to artificial intelligence. There's a wonderful contest globally called the International Genetically Engineered Machine Contest. Yale competes every other year in this contest, and Yale competed in 2025. They did extremely well. In 2025, Yale got a silver medal recognition at this international conference that draws competitors from all over the world, 400 plus teams. The silver medal is against certain standards of performance that every team is eligible to receive. Yale received it. And it also was recognized last year with what's called the iGEMers Prize, which is the team judged by their peers to most represent the spirit of the contest, which is all about synthetic biology. So Yale did pretty well. It wasn't, however, in the top 10 that year. Last year, in the top 10, number 1 was McGill, but 6 of the top 10 universities were from China. Let's go back a little further to high school, because high school is the generation coming to college, going on into career. Very interesting, the US has an incredible competitor in the iGEM from Georgia called Lambert High School, based in Suwanee, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. And that team actually won the contest in 2022. So they're incredible. And this last year, they had an invention that would shorten the time of diagnosis of Lyme disease from 2 weeks after infection to 2 days. A fabulous advance. And they ended up in the top 10. But take a look. 7 of the top 10, including numbers 1 through 7, were from Chinese high schools. Let's look at what the US has done in the way of investing in science over the years. Here's a plot of federal non-defense research and development spending over the last 50 years. And in general, you can see in nominal dollars that it has gone up. There have been periods of flattening, and then there was a period of kind of doubling and then undoubling of the investment, especially at the NIH. And then we get to 2023 and 2025 finally, and we've kind of drawn back. And the president had actually proposed a cut for 2026, 40% in the NIH, 55% in the NSF. The Congress, fortunately, restored the budget and kept it essentially flat between 2025 and 2026. But here's another story. This is science's share of federal discretionary spending, non-defense research, as a fraction of discretionary spending over the last 60 years. And what we see is in the post-Sputnik era, there was a burst. It continued on an upward trajectory to a peak in 2001, just around the time that Norm Augustine and the National Academies started to sound an alarm. And in response, or at the same time following, we have had a steady decline in the fraction of total discretionary spending devoted to science of about 1/3, from a peak of 8.5% to now about 5.6%. And if the president's budget had been enacted, it would have been as low as it had been 20 plus years earlier. Remember, don't tell me where your priorities are. Show me where you spend your money, and I'll tell you what they are. And the honest truth is that neither party, over a long period of time, has accorded science in America sufficient priority to keep us in the lead. In fact, if you look at total R&D investment measured in what's called purchasing power parity dollars, this is a way of equilibrating how much you get for a dollar spent in different countries. It's a fair way of comparing how much a country is investing in anything. But this shows in 2015 constant purchasing power parity dollars how much the US has spent on R&D compared to China. And in 2000, the US spent more than 8 times as much. In 2020, it was a little more, 10% compared to China. In 2024, for the first time, measured in purchasing power parity dollars, China was spending a little bit more than the United States on science. And here's our future trajectory. Xi Jinping said we're going to invest 8.3% this year in science, increase. Congress, 0%. The OECD projects that by 2030, on current trajectory, China's spending will exceed that of the United States by more than 30%. So how are we responding? Well, one of the areas the US was still leading was vaccines and medical countermeasures. But last year, our Department of Health and Human Services withdrew $500 million of investment in next generation vaccines, cutting out all research on the next generation of mRNA vaccines, while Chinese companies are doubling down and tripling down on their investment. If you look at the biopharmaceuticals, which is another strength of America, and we lead in many aspects, but on some measures, China is also equating or exceeding US. The number of clinical trials underway, for example, in 2020, for the first time, China surpassed the United States. An important new technology for treatment are called antibody-drug conjugates. These are drugs that combine an antibody that attaches to a target cell with a chemical treatment. So it's like a laser treatment for, let's say, a cancer cell, for example. In this area, estimate over the last 10 years is that China has developed more than 70% of the antibody-drug conjugates in the world. And Chinese companies are now licensing more than half of all licenses for drug development to other drug companies for further development and marketing. It's not only in the core of science. I first visited China more than 50 years ago, if you can believe it, still in the time of Cultural Revolution. And in 1975, the streets were filled with bicycles. And everyone was wearing either a blue Mao jacket or a gray Mao jacket. And I mean all men and all women. It was the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. Doctors, I saw, were still out doing physical manual labor. China in 50 years has transformed itself more dramatically than any country in a similar period of time in the history of humanity. It started gaining acceleration with Deng Xiaoping's leadership following Mao's death in 1976. He had taken power by 78. And he was famous for a lot of aphorisms, but his main idea was to be rich is glorious. And he said, it doesn't matter whether it is a yellow cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice, it is a good cat, an old Sichuan saying. So by 2024, where the US had now 300 million automotive vehicles, trucks and cars and buses on the road, China already had 435 million and had surpassed us in the total number, but not just in the total, but in electric vehicles. Here's a depiction of the leading auto manufacturer in China compared to Tesla, which, as you may know, opened a plant in China to get access to the Chinese market. And they're pretty much neck and neck. There was a year, 2022, where BYD really overtook Tesla. Tesla came back with a remodeled 3, and so they've done pretty well. But here's another story. Have you heard about the Apple car? Have you seen any? No. Why? Well, in 2014, Apple launched a project they called Project Titan. They were going to make a fully automated automobile. They spent 10 years. They spent $10 billion, and then they canceled the project. Now, it's true, they gained a lot of knowledge about AI and other products from this, but at the end of the day, no car. Another company in China called Xiaomi started in 2021. Xiaomi, by the way, produces smartphones, televisions. It's an electronics company. It's sometimes called the Apple of China. And in 3 years, with $3 billion, they released a car called the SU7, launched in March of 2024. Now, here's a picture of the Ford Mustang Mach-E electric vehicle on one side and the Xiaomi SU7 on the other. About one of these vehicles, the CEO of Ford, whose name is Jim Farley, said, "It's fantastic. I don't want to give it up." You're right. He had a wonderful habit, actually, of driving the competitors' vehicles. He personally imported an SU7, and that was what he said in his podcast. What is also remarkable is that the SU7 in 2 years has actually released a second, more advanced, better model, and they had 89,000 pre-orders in the first weeks after it was announced in January of this year. This is actually me this past weekend at the showroom. And let me tell you, it's a very sweet car. Here's another story, Tale of Two Railways. 2008, California voters approve a high-speed railway, San Francisco to Los Angeles. Have you ridden that? Is there a single mile of track laid? No. Same year, China starts building its Beijing to Shanghai, also about 800 miles. They finish in 2011. They spend $36 billion compared to what now is estimated conservatively to cost California $128 billion if it ever does build its high-speed railway. I rode that train. Let me tell you, it's fantastic. But I'm only one of more than 1.5 billion passengers now who've ridden on that high-speed rail. This is one of the examples, Dan Wang, who recently wrote a book that contrasts what he calls America's society that's lawyerly with the engineering state of China. Getting things done, stressing process. Two different approaches to progress. China is the world leader in clean energy. It has 40% of the world's renewable energy capacity now. It has invested more than double of what any other country has invested in the energy transition. In China today, 32 nuclear plants are under construction. How many in the US? Yep, you can count them on no hands. We don't have any right now. It's not only generally in energy, solar panels. China, by a combination of technological advance, government subsidy, production at scale, reduced the price of solar panels by 40% in 1 year in 2023. And they began to dominate the world's market. And let me tell you, it is very hard to find another panel made outside of China that has the price performance value that the Chinese-made solar panels. We've all heard about the rare earth dominance of China. And you may not be aware that 90% of consumer drones are made in China, mainly by DJI. Overall industrial capacity of the world, it's estimated that by 2030, Chinese industrial capacity will be more than double the United States, Japan, Germany, and India combined. 45% against a total of 22, and the US half of that at 11%. Chinese goods make up the world's stuff. But China has its challenges. It has a lot of problems. This industrial dominance comes with a lot of excess capacity that they have not managed to constrict. And it is a problem for China, but it is also a deterrent for others getting into a lot of industries. Their real estate sector is in crisis. They've had a lot of overbuilding. They've had defaults on debt. They've had falling prices. And most of Chinese family wealth is tied up in the real estate, so this is a very serious problem. If you're under age 24 in China, it's very hard to get a job. So they have a very high youth unemployment. And while we think of our debt as mainly our federal debt, because localities and states are by law required to meet their budgets with revenues, in China, the majority of debt is local government debt. And they have a very serious problem of excess local government debt. So they have some things to worry about as well. But in science, they are doing well. But what is it for us if we are able and willing? What can America do? So I submit this is really a Sputnik moment for America. It's not just about space, it's about all of science and technology. And the first order of business is we have to disenthrall ourselves from illusions about America's lasting dominance in science as a birthright. It has to be earned. It is not given to us. It is not guaranteed. And the diminishing share of federal dollars that have been invested in science over time have accumulated to put us in the predicament that we now find ourselves. So I want to outline very briefly things that we can do that are under our control that are more tactical, short term, and 5 critical steps that I believe our nation needs to take if we're to remain in the race for the future. First, we have to thank our champions for science. And I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I want to get to the strategic steps. But do you know that Representative DeLauro, who is your representative, is a key figure on the House Appropriations Committee, and she was one of the most important individuals to save funding for science this year in the Congress and for health. So if you live here and you have not written to Representative DeLauro, go on the website. For those of you who are using your phones now, it's okay. You can go onto Representative DeLauro's website and tell her thank you. Because without these key figures in Congress, in appropriations, standing up for a budget that was at least flat, we would be in dire trouble this year. Secondly, oh yes, Tom Cole. Well, I want you to thank everyone. I'll tell you though, it's very hard to thank a congressperson who's not in your district. You have to write to them an old-fashioned letter, and then it goes somewhere where they burn them before they deliver them for security. So it's really tricky. But you can reach your own representative. You can reach any senator by electronic means. I tried to reach some representatives and I couldn't do it electronically. So, but DeLauro is yours, so go for it. Most of us, we think science should sell itself. I mean, science is so intrinsically good, everybody should realize how good it is, just like they should realize how good higher education is. Well, no, we have to make the case. We have to support the institutions. We have to support the groups who are advocating for science just as we do for education. We have to bring more voices in support of science outside of the scientific and academic community because they don't have a vested interest, but they can appreciate the importance. So when leaders in the media, leaders in business step forward and say our nation depends on science and investment in science, that means a lot. We have to worry about the things, even with the budget, that are politically unpopular but necessary. The vaccine situation in the US is dire, so we need to take steps there. Anyone who's here involved in earth sciences or environmental sciences, you know what a difficult time it is. So we have to work on those. And then for many scientists today, the term gold standard has kind of taken on a fool's gold meaning because it's been touted by the administration as the way forward for science. But I would urge that you look at it open-mindedly and ask yourself what's good and what's not good about this, and try to get involved in the debate, because it is about improving the process of science that all of us engaged with science recognize is also an important goal for us to do. But what do we need to do strategically? Let me outline 5 critical steps. First, we need to make long-term, consistent additions to our investment in science. I'm proposing a minimum of 6% per year for 12 years. We have to avoid the doubling, undoubling syndrome. This is very hard for a Congress that turns over every 2 years, very hard for a country that isn't accustomed to long-term commitments. But there's a strong economic case for the benefits of investment in science, in biomedical science. And we need to make it, and we need leadership that supports it. In today's climate, I understand people will say, boy, that's unrealistic. We were so relieved just to get a flat budget. What are you talking about, plus 6%? And I would submit, do you want to win in the race, or are you just content to lose more slowly? What is your preference? Because that's the choice. And I hope our leadership can make the right choice. Consistent, year by year, is much better than dramatic 1 year and then pull back, because that's the way we can absorb it and put it to best use and make the most progress. Secondly, I don't think we can anymore have the luxury of avoiding any definition of domains of science that are particularly important for the country. The president and the administration have put forward a project they call Project Genesis. It is about employing AI throughout science. I think it's a wonderfully good idea. It is one strategy. We need a set of strategic objectives that are developed with wide consultation, determined and advanced as priorities for our nation to improve our science, our economy, and the world's well-being. Third, we have to pursue talent worldwide, and we have to nurture our own. If you're in China and you are a 1 in a million talent, there are 1,400 others just as talented as you are. That's enough to fill the whole freshman class at Princeton, actually. So it's a lot of people. If you're here in the US, same talent, you've got 350 peers. We need to attract the best in the world. America cannot succeed if it's not bringing people in. At one time in our history, we did have merit-based immigration. We need to restore it. We need to ensure that when you come here and you get your degree, you can stay, and you are welcome, and you will be supported, and you will have the opportunity to do more here for what you care about than you could possibly have anywhere else in the world. That has got to be our message. And we have to do so much more with our home. We need more Lambert High Schools in the country. We need to nurture our own expertise. We need to bring talent from every corner of the country and give it the opportunity to shine. We're not yet doing this. We do need to diversify our funding sources. It's not only the federal government, though the federal government is essential and the core. We need states to get more involved. We need philanthropy to get more involved. And we need industry to get more engaged in the whole spectrum of science that is relevant to that industry. And finally, and this gets back to President McGinnis's first point about education, we have to re-engage the public, because we cannot presume public support for science any more than we could presume it for education. And there are many examples already underway of trying to do this in a more proactive and positive way. One of my favorites is the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, that graduate students here at Yale and around the country have stepped forward and said, we're engaged. We want to make a difference. We want to be great scientists, and we want to do it simultaneously by helping the public understand why what we're trying to do matters to them. And this is a great, great step forward. What we need to adopt is not a knee-jerk response that we have to avoid all international engagement, and especially with China. We have to be able to differentiate areas of science and technology that do require protection, intellectual property, national security technologies, and the like, and differentiate those from technologies and domains of science that benefit from cooperation. And indeed, I would submit, for many of the global challenges our world is facing, whether you're talking about ocean fisheries, or you're talking about climate impacts, or you're talking about any other form of international progress, it's going to take cooperation at least by the US and China, because the world cannot solve these problems without those leaders taking part. So what's at stake in this is really very important in my mind. And it's not just that any science benefits everyone, which is true. And I'm a globalist at heart. I love the idea of working around the world on science. But there's more at stake. I would say the conventional wisdom through most of the last century of America was, if you want to have progress in society, it depends on individual liberty, democracy, the rule of law, and free market capitalism. Those are the keys. You've probably all heard this. China has shown in the 21st century that you can have authoritarian rule, ideological discipline, party supremacy, and state capitalism. They don't use that term. Essentially, that's what it is, in my opinion. And you can produce stunning material gains, in fact, unprecedented in the history of the planet. So what's at stake in America's revival of its investment in science isn't merely which cat catches more mice, or what country grows faster relative to others. It is which system of values, what bedrock principles of how we live our lives are going to prevail in the world. And that does matter. So the race isn't over. But we've got, if it's a horse around the track, I would say we've got one at a slow trot and one galloping. They're neck and neck, but we better get a little whip on the horse that's trotting. We need to rouse ourselves. This is a Sputnik moment. We need to invest steadily. We need to invest strategically. We need to bring more players into the game. We need to build our talent pool at home, and we need to make talent from everywhere in the world at home in America. And we need to engage the public as our partners, not as our audience. We need to approach the public in a spirit of listening and learning, not in the spirit of instructing and teaching. And we need to compete smartly and collaborate wisely. So, who stands to win this race? My preferred answer is humanity. Because if the best science and the right values prevail, it is humanity that will benefit. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Sure.
We are now going to turn to the portion where Dr. Fineberg answers some of your questions. So, QR code on the screen. Please feel free to open your phones if you have a question. Please go ahead and submit. And maybe I'll start with just sort of a starter on this. Thank you so much for just a really eye-opening lecture, I think, for many of us. I think there are pieces of that story that many of us in the audience were aware of, but pulling it all together and boiling down really what is at stake and what it will take for us to get to a place of seizing this opportunity. I'm sure you, like I, have spent a lot of time in DC and working and talking with policymakers, and they rhetorically will agree, yes, we need to be able to compete with China. And yet it doesn't seem that in policy they are grasping that. I wonder if you have some thoughts on how we get our lawmakers and our policymakers to really see this.
Thank you for starting with such an easy question. It is true. You know, my impression from my time in Washington is that fundamentally the Congress is really a cross-section of the American public. I mean, that's whom we elect. The only difference being, on average, they're a little more personable than our average person, but otherwise, they're like us. And so that means they have the whole spectrum of prejudices, beliefs, backgrounds, experiences, desires, etc. And another reality is that our Congress is now more polarized and divided than in my memory ever. And a third reality is that our Congress responds to crises more than it creates opportunities. Now, that's not always the case, but it is too often the case. So first, there's no way to do this without leadership. So the first step is to find the champions in the Congress who not only rhetorically would agree, but would have the gumption and the willingness to say, yes, we're going to go back to our science caucus, which is bipartisan, and we are going to come up with a draft that is an America Wins Act. And you've given us fuel and you've given us data. We are going to do that. So that's the first step, is finding the leadership. Secondly, politics is really local, and honestly, scientists and certainly biomedical people are all over the country. We need to do a better job of mobilizing in every congressional district, never mind every state, champions for science and for health who will go to their representatives and say, we support you and we want you to do this. This is good for America. This is not about a partisan differentiator. This is about America's place in the world, and it's about your children's health, and it's about my grandchildren, and it's about what we do to make our lives better, and we need your support. So we need to diffuse and strengthen the engagement with our political leadership at the local level in every congressional district in the country. And third, we need to vote.
So kind of following up on that, you speak to audiences around the country, and the question is around which audiences have been most responsive to your call to action, and what have you learned from those experiences that could help inform us about advocacy and communication strategies in order to achieve what you were just telling us?
Yeah, honestly, I feel not really qualified to answer this question, because I would love to be doing more listening personally around the country. I'm particularly, now I'm based in California. It's a state on the west part of the country, and California has so many assets. I mean, history, financial, people, industry. I want to personally work also at the state level, and I think Connecticut should be in this game. Massachusetts is getting in the game, New York will be. But right now, the big players are California and Texas. So part of it is, for me, would be listening and working with the people in communities where I live. I think going around the country, to me, the most important starting point is knowing enough to hear what matters to your audience so that you can connect to that desire. And most people in my limited experience, they all pretty much want the same things. We want good schools for our children. We want a safe community to live in. We want a good job that's not too far from where we live. And we want to know that our children will have a better life than we do. And that can be answered through science. So I hope we can carry that message.
Yeah. We have several in the audience who want to understand, you focused on the US and China as the two big global players, but where else do you see areas of considerable strength? EU, India, where else and where are they?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the specific domain, but Europe is a key player in science. The Large Hadron Collider was built in Europe. It wasn't built in Texas. We actually started it and we gave it up. And Higgs boson discoveries were a European discovery. So Europe is definitely in the science race. Europe has its own set of challenges and real difficulties. So it's not a singular advantage, but it has real capacity. If you look at generic drug production, vaccine production, India is in the lead. Mm-hmm. So, each zone does have certain distinctive advantages. At the end of the day, though, in today's world, if you really, in my opinion, want to solve major global problems, it's pretty hard to do it without the US and China. So you can have others, and the others can even take a lead in some areas, but they've got to bring in China and the US.
Yeah. So as you think about, you were talking predominantly about federal support, and that has always been the single largest sort of investor in scientific research. Certainly, when you speak with policymakers today, they are quite taken with the idea that private enterprise should be playing a more significant role. I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
They're not wrong. And private enterprise and philanthropy and states should be pitching in more. Philanthropy in science has magnified significantly in the last decade. When I started at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and we stood up the Science Philanthropy Alliance, there were 6 members. When I left earlier this year, there were over 40 members. So philanthropy is organizing, is stepping up, is gaining momentum for support of science. Philanthropy always fills and looks for the gaps where the government is not funding and where others, industry is not funding. So it's an important adjunct, but it's not a substitute. There may be some instances where you can actually establish partnerships so that it would be more attractive for especially state governments to invest public money in science if they know that there is a counterpart fund from philanthropy and or industry that would augment the state fund. And I think that is actually a promising strategy for the future. At the federal level, I think it is harder to organize for the whole nation, but an idea that you would potentially incentivize funding contingent on other funding is not a crazy idea.
Thoughts on the role of other disciplines, the humanities, the social sciences? What role might they be able to play in advancing interdisciplinary research and winning the hearts and minds?
Yes, well, this is, I guess, the social sciences are all about understanding behavior and social interaction and our ways of thinking and how we come to the choices we do. So there's a huge role to help all of us who want to promote more effective, evidence-based, scientific ideas in the social science. But we were actually chatting earlier about the recognition of many of the advanced communities like AI, that they now need more humanistic input. They need people from philosophy, they need ethicists, they need those who can bring a sense of the human values to be part of the development of human-centered future AI. And I think that that notion where you kind of juxtapose humanistic understanding with scientific and technologic progress would make for a much sounder future of development for really challenging technologies. AI is one example, genetic engineering, CRISPR technology is another example. And if we don't engage those with a strong ethical base, we are really going to shortchange ourselves.
Yeah. Another question that relates to how we effectively move public opinion and policy on this speaks to the ecosystem that is necessary to help translate scientific discoveries to a real-world understanding. And it needs policy, we need markets, we need public supports and more. Can you talk a little bit more about how you think about work we need to do to develop the ecosystem that allows us to do this more effectively?
Yes, I think we need to have a much stronger sense of partnership with our community from the beginning, from the get-go, from the planning. One of the big lessons actually of the HIV pandemic 40 years ago was the critical value of including community in the planning of all of the research that was going to be done, especially the clinical trials. That carried over to the breast cancer movement, and it's carried over in other ways in the biomedical space. I think that greater engagement of a public will be a very important tool for achieving the kind of public understanding that we're seeking. I feel the first step for public understanding of science is scientists understanding the public. And that means genuine partnership.
Yeah. Great way to phrase that. You've touched just a little bit on AI, and obviously in many rooms you're probably in California, that's the only thing anybody wants to talk about. But I'm curious, as you think about the disruption that AI is bringing and the opportunity it represents, we'll leave the sort of dangers on the other side. How do you think it changes the picture you presented to us?
Well, Project Genesis that I alluded to is all about changing this picture. From the point of view of scientific research, in every way from design of studies, we already have design of molecules, design of data assessment, interpretation, eventually, I believe, also learning from the results and implications for further assessment. When you combine the possibilities of vast amounts of data in an accessible form, electronically, with the growing power of AI for analytics and the ingenuity of those who will know how to ask the right questions, which I think is actually going to be, already it's an important skill for academician and for scholarship and for science. I think it's going to become the critical skill. I think that utilization of AI at every stage of the science enterprise has the potential to radically accelerate progress. So I'm kind of a techno-optimist.
Good. Well, for our final question, we have a room full of people who are either themselves currently scientists, they might be at different stages of their career. We have faculty, postdocs, grad students, undergraduate students, and we have many friends of science in this room. Talk to us about the role that individuals can play in the important work we need to do.
Well, I love that opportunity, because the first message I would convey is do your science well. If you're in science, your first job is to do the science. And nothing else can distract you from the passion that you are driven by and that made you want to do science. Let that play. And today it's not enough, because as a scientist you are also a role model. You're also a spokesperson. You're also a representative. You're a champion, and you should be an ambassador for science. And that means you have a responsibility as a scientist to do more than just your science, though that is your passion and the center of what you do. Because I believe that if we do not do more as a community of scientists and science supporters to speak to our friends, our families, our community members, a broader public, of why we believe what we're doing matters and why we all should be behind it, and how much we all have benefited from our predecessors who did what we're doing, I think we're going to lose out eventually on the support that we need. So we do your science, you become an ambassador, and you accept the responsibilities of citizenship to be also, as the time and opportunity arises, to demonstrate your leadership and your willingness to serve your community in ways that go beyond the science and beyond just talk. So I hope that the rising generation of scientists will be ready to take up this challenge, that more will feel that they can do outstanding science plus, and the country depends on both.
Everyone join me in thanking Dr. Fineberg.
Thank you so much.